So if you've tucked that away in your Bible, or if you didn't, it's also in the order of worship this week. It's the same one from last week that sort of covers chapters 13 through 15. So we looked at 13 last week. And just to review, in 1 Samuel 13, this was the beginning. We might call this the beginning of the end for Saul. You don't know that by the time you get to 13. In fact, when 13 starts, chapter 13 starts, things have been good for Saul and Israel. And remember, he's the first king, so there was this controversy from really chapter 7 and 8 on as to whether Israel should have a king. The elders actually were the ones asking for the king. And you remember, I won't go into all the arguments for and against, but the elders were for it, Samuel was against it, and God said, let them have it. So then the question became, all right, well, who? God says we can have a king. Who will be the first king? All right? And it was, from a human perspective, random. No one knew who Saul was. Saul was a nobody, and he became a somebody because he met Samuel. Samuel anointed him as king. Saul defeated the Ammonites, already proved himself in battle, which was one reason Israel's elders wanted a king. So all that to say, up through chapter 12, things have been looking good for Saul. But remember, at the end of chapter 12, in Samuel's farewell speech, Samuel, the last of the judges, and this is really the transition to the kingship. Saul's already been anointed, twice, or anointed once, but proclaimed as king privately and publicly. Samuel gives his farewell address, and then again, there's those last two verses in chapter 12, which foreshadow the trouble that's going to come for the king and for Israel if the king is not virtuous, if he does not obey the law, all right? God's law. And so in chapter 13, we saw last week, again, what I just described as the beginning of the end for Saul, the turn, the pivot in Saul's story, where, things aren't going to just be nice and easy and hunky-dory for Saul, all right? He has shown the first obvious or clear instance of disobedience. He was supposed to wait for Samuel, who was going to offer the sacrifices and consult the Lord. Saul, on the seventh day, not at the end of it, but on the seventh, did long enough, all right? So there's a lesson there about waiting and patience, but also about obedience. So that brings us to chapter 14 and 15, which is where we are this week, all right? Chapter 14 introduces Jonathan as the son of Saul, who, this is sort of a long chapter. I'm not going to go into all the details here. Assume you read this, had a couple of weeks to read this for homework. But Jonathan basically goes for a personal victory against the Philistines. So he sneaks into their camp and actually assassinates, seems like one of the Philistine leaders or prefects, which then incited the Philistines to pursue the Israelites. And so we have the story of the Battle of Michmash here. And if you can follow all the goings and comings of these armies, and that map on the back of this handout helps you, then great. I copied that from a commentary and thought, somebody might enjoy seeing that there. It's hard for me to make heads or tails of this. So what I'm asking, what I kind of want to know is, why is this story here? What is this story here for in chapter 14? How does it kind of fit into this narrative? Because it almost seems like an interruption from chapter 13 and 15. Because in 15, we'll see again how Saul makes yet another mistake. all right? So it's kind of sandwiched in between these two instances of Saul's disobedience. What's it doing there? Well, okay, that's one way to look at it. I think just this is an important story about Jonathan and Saul. It could be that Jonathan is emerging as, in some ways, maybe the next potential person in the line of king, the dynasty here. Now that this is a monarchy, we've not had a dynasty under the judges, but maybe now we will have a king and his sons as heirs and successors to that. That's probably the assumption here. But maybe even a threat to Saul's present position, okay? Because remember back in chapter 13, when Samuel said, Saul, your kingdom will be taken from you, that's not clear that it's going to be taken from his family. It's just going to be taken from you, okay? Could be the way that that's heard. And in chapter 13, verse 14, I'm looking back just a little bit here, Samuel says, now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. All right? Man after or according to God's own heart. Who is that? David, yes. But if you're just reading along in the story here, we don't know who that is. All right? David is not named here. So what chapter 13 is clear about is, Saul, your kingdom will be taken from you individually. God has someone else in mind now. All right? And then the very next story basically is, look at Jonathan's courage in victory. All right? So David's not been named yet. Okay, we haven't heard of him in 1 Samuel. And so the reader in the story might be just thinking, this is the rise of Jonathan now as the next king. But that's kind of the question I think that's left here is, will he be the next king? All right. So, Jonathan goes, as I say, and gets sort of a victory by stealth. And you notice he's very confident in his victory before it even happens. Why is he so confident in his and Israel's victory over the Philistines? I think you see it throughout when you see him talking about this, the language he uses about this. Exactly. He invokes God throughout all of this, all right? Verse 6, verse 10, as I'm just skimming through here. We won't read all of these, but look at verse 12. So in 14:12, the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. All right? So God can save. All right? Verse 23, you see the same thing. Is there a lesson here for us? This sort of confidence in God to, as Deanna read there, God can save by many or by few. All right? So we see an instance of that here. I really like Jonathan's faith here in God's ability to save, all right, and to accomplish his will, whether we are many or few. So God worked for Jonathan in all of this and, helped kill the Philistines. And some of this, you see God's help in this. I notice even in verse 15, in some versions, God's name is sort of, or reference to God is sort of taken out from some of these Hebrew idioms. Like if you look at just one example of this, in verse 15, it says, there was a panic in the camp in the field among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled, the earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. The last phrase there in verse 15. Literally in Hebrew, that says, It was a panic or a shuddering from God. So God is active in this, in sort of working, outside, it seems like, even of sort of the natural element here to create, or at least incite some sort of panic in the Philistines, which we've seen before in some of the battles in Israel's history here. But the point is, there is a divine participation in this. Jonathan recognizes it. He is confident in it, and he is encouraging his men with it. And then the narrator is pointing out how God is involved in this. All right, another element of this story is Saul forbidding eating. He commands his soldiers to go on a fast, okay, until they're victorious, all right, until he says so, basically, until he lifts the fast. Jonathan doesn't know this. He doesn't hear this. And so he's walking along and obviously very tired, needs energy, and he eats something. So Saul has vowed that whoever breaks this fast, what? Is going to die. Yeah. And so when he hears that his son Jonathan broke the fast, what does Saul say? Yeah. You would think maybe he's going to be merciful and say, well, that was a silly vow or something. But no. Chapter 14, verse 44. Saul said, God, do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. The Hebrew idiom there is dying, you will die. There's no clearer way to say, no, you're not exempt from this. Not exempt because you're my son, and you're not exempt because you were ignorant of this command. All right? You're going to die. So, interesting, the next verse there, Saul is basically outvoted by his own army. All right? Because everybody recognizes Jonathan actually was the one leading us, and on the human side of this, yes, God was the victor here, but he was the one leading us, cooperating with God to bring about this amazing victory. So the soldiers, it says in verse 45, rescued, some translations will say ransomed, Jonathan from that vow, from the hands of Saul, because he had worked with God to gain this victory. So just looking at chapter 14, again, just taking kind of a big picture here, it's interesting that Jonathan is on the rise right after we heard that Saul's kingdom will be no more. Jonathan is on the rise, and Saul is pitted against his own son Jonathan here by the end of this. So it's troubling, I think, how quick Saul was to say, yeah, he will surely die for this. Yeah. Could be, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Could be, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right, is that Saul, whatever it is, Saul is showing his lack of talent for the kind of leadership that Israel needs. Y'all come on in. Good to see you. Yeah, absolutely. Take a seat anywhere there. We're in the middle, actually, of our Bible study. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and 15. All right, anything else there from 14? Darren? Yeah, for sure. So the question here is, we see lots of connections between the story in Judges and here in First Samuel, for sure. I mean, part of that's just because it's a continuation of the history in the same places, so place names and events are kind of apt to overlap. But yeah, I think some of these themes, it's certainly helpful to know the content of the book of Judges as you get into 1 Samuel, which is just continuing the story, isn't it? Right? So the vow, Jephthah's rash vow, and what I mean, apparently it doesn't describe him actually going through with it, but apparently the text indicates that he did sacrifice his own child, all right? Which is sort of what Saul seems prepared to do here, right? So there is, I think, a lot of connections there. Certainly the readers who knew those stories would look back on that and say, yeah, I know that story. That reminds me of that story about Jephthah. Certainly the fact that Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. The last thing we see in the book of Judges, the last event, is Israel waging war against the Benjaminites and nearly wiping out Benjamin. And then their first king is from this tribe, all right? So there may have been some lingering animosity with Saul as a representative of that tribe that we were at war against just a few years ago, all right? So, yeah, a good commentary will bring out some of these cross-references. Even some of those, if you're familiar with the stories, we'll see jump out at us. Others are maybe a little more subtle as well. Good. Anything else on 14 there? All right. Well, let's look forward to chapter and move on to chapter 15 here. We're in 1 Samuel 15. And here we're going to see another mistake by King Saul, and I would say a worse mistake than the one he made back in chapter 13 when he offered the sacrifices. And this mistake this time is going to serve as sort of an occasion for Samuel to say something important about Saul and his reign, but also just, I think, a theologically important statement for all of us here that's anticipated. So, verse 3, there is a command for Saul to go and strike. So I'm looking at chapter 15, verse 3. Go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, okay? But it says to kill everyone and everything that they have. Well, this is kind of a tough passage for today, isn't it? Anyway, so that's the command, all right? Why this command to Israel about who's Amalek? Who are the Amalekites? Again, you kind of have to know the story here, but is this just some random person or tribe or group out of nowhere? And sort of God arbitrarily says, go destroy them? No, it's not that. Okay, that was a rhetorical question. But who is this? Anybody remember Amalekites? It's one of those ites, that are listed in all those names that you often just kind of eyes glaze over when you're reading through the Old Testament. Okay, so back in John. They were uncooperative after the Exodus. That is exactly right. Yes. Perhaps an understatement. Exactly. Exactly right. So just so everybody can hear, when the Israelites are at their most vulnerable point, they're coming out of Egypt. They don't have anything except for what they took with them. They don't have a place. They're not really yet a nation. They're fresh out of Egypt. Again, at their most vulnerable point, the Amalekites, this nation of people, say, let's take advantage of them. Instead of saying, how can we help you, or pass through peacefully, which is all Israel said they wanted to do, no, we're going to destroy you, is what Amalekites said. And so God took notice of that. If you look ahead also to Deuteronomy, but ahead from the Exodus to Deuteronomy chapter 25, I'm looking at verses 17 through 19. So remember, Deuteronomy sets the stage and the plan for all of these historical books that we're looking at: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Deuteronomy is looking towards that and saying, you're about to enter the land. How are you going to be? How are you going to behave when you're in the land? So, and what are some of the things you need to keep in mind? Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind, and he did not fear God. It's saying it like it's one person, but it's Amalek standing for the nation of people. Okay. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. It's interesting language there.